They just have an inflated expectation around value.
And if you can't get a deal done, enterprise value is going to equal zero.
And I can count on one hand the founders who sold their firm alone that felt good about it. Hello, and welcome to this week's Shoot the Moon podcast, broadcasting live and direct from Revenue Rocket World Headquarters in Bloomington, Minnesota. As you know, for our frequent followers, Revenue Rocket is the world's premier M&A advisor to IT and OT firms in the tech space. With me today are my partners, Matt Lockhart and Ryan Burnett. Welcome, guys.
Great to be here, and it is interesting how more and more there's a convergence between IT and OT in the tech-enabled services space. So it's fun to be there, fun to be here. Not a cloud in the sky. The sun is shining, and there's a lot of action going on. So I know we got a great topic, Brian, for people who are thinking about selling their business.
Yeah, absolutely. And as Mike mentioned, we're 100% focused on that IT services space. And what we do is help people through the M&A process and help them grow their company, grow both revenue and profit as you're working day to day. And oftentimes when you're in a hot market like we're in, for example, we work with a lot of managed service providers. There's a lot of people and buyers that are out in the market, and they approach sellers quite often. And it's fairly easy to get pulled into a conversation in which you want to go and take a look at an offer and perhaps run alone. And so, you can definitely build a company that is profitable and can scale. There are a bit of risks that come with it, and oftentimes that biggest risk is actually a decreased sale price for the firm, and a lot of risk that it comes to even getting a deal done. So one of the most common questions we get is, do I really need an advisor? And so I really wanted to look at that topic and understand, using a few of the stats in our industry, about this. So, Mike, you've had a few opinions for this for quite some time. So, and granted, we're coming from the angle as M&A advisor, so I think we might know what angle you're coming from. But help us understand. Should a firm sell themselves, and what's the data say about using an advisor versus going alone?
Yeah, great question, Ryan. It's interesting. We have long held no, because what our clients tell us after we help them sell their business, that they say things like, well, we couldn't have done it without you. You showed great value in the process. Very happy we had you. And I think the stats bear that out. I think what's interesting is, only according to some of the stats, only 20 to 30% of listed businesses sell. Now, if you consider, stats from IBBA and others, they say 75 to 90% actually never close. And what's implied in all those numbers is there's a lot of people that try to do it themselves. The best brokers have high close rates, 80 to 95%. I'm proud to say we fall into that category. When we bring a client to market, our stats are in that range. When we start to look at average, only 35 to 40% actually get done. So interesting stuff. If someone does a sale, we'll call it a for sale by owner, doesn't use an advisor, we know the percentages based on studies are under 10% actually close. We've seen some studies that say, 1% close or less. So it sort of depends on your source, but, the credible sources have it under 10%. We know that businesses typically sell anywhere, the studies range from 6 to 25% higher with an advisor, kind of per Axial and others. And most studies say that, about 20% higher is a number you can hang your hat on. And there's a variety of studies that have been done over the last 20 years with thousands of firms that hover around that number. And with an advisor in 2025, for example, per biz buy sell, 94% sold at their asking price if they use an advisor. So certainly very interesting stats, Ryan. And I think the numbers bear out that if you want to maximize your value, the enterprise value, price and terms on your deal, and minimize your headaches, you should be using an advisor.
Yeah. Thanks for setting the table here, Mike. I think you've got two huge numbers that you should consider in your model. So one is the percentage can you get a deal done? And if you can't get a deal done, enterprise value is going to equal zero, and you're out a lot more than just not getting a deal done. You're out wasted time, you're out wasted opportunities, and it emotionally scars you. And there's a lot of drain that comes with that. And then just to reiterate, the other number is just what does the deal and the terms look like that are favorable to the seller? And so, as you mentioned, between 6 and 25%, we've seen 20% oftentimes quoted as just getting more return when you actually utilize someone that's on your side of the table. Matt, I'd love to understand, just throughout that, it's hard to get this deal done. So if we think of the first part of that equation, why do deals die when founders start to go alone?
Yeah. There's a variety of reasons. I think let's just start from the baseline that there is an art and a science to selling your business. And whenever that's the case, you need people who are experienced. You need experts. You need people who've been there before and done it before to be able to be effective and execute and to get across that finish line. And what comes with that experience, and we've advocated and really said you don't just find a broker or an advisor or an investment bank that is a generalist. It really matters to have a specialty like we do here at Revenue Rocket, and with that expertise and that knowledge and that specialization, you understand what the market is, and you understand what the appropriate, expectations should be. And specifically, what the enterprise value expectations should be, what the asking price should be, or the valuation of your business. So often we've heard from clients of our own or just out in the network, an individual tried to go it alone, and he heard from a friend, or he heard from a friend of a friend that they sold their business for this, and so my business is worth this. And it's just not reality. And so, oftentimes the number one factor is a seller. Oftentimes, we're working with founder-led businesses. They just have an inflated expectation around value, and that's a deal killer, right out of the gate. And then there's some of the more art aspects of it, right? In terms of ensuring that a seller has a good plan to execute upon the sale of their business. They have set their business up and can be backed up with the data and reality that there's succession plans in place, that there is a good forecast in the ongoing growth of the business, that forecast is based upon a strong pipeline that can be represented appropriately, and then demonstrated by a successful go-to-market. That's just one example of the art of ensuring that, what you are asking for is backed up by the data and then, by the story. And then, finally, there's it's not easy. There's a lot of moving parts when you're selling your business, from the preparation of the marketing materials and the message and the like, and then just the intricacies of processing NDAs, qualifying appropriate buyers, understanding that there are, pretenders out there. Understanding the funding sources and the viability of buyers. I mean, there's just all of this that goes into doing what we do every day that somebody who isn't experienced in it, and then more than that, somebody who is running their business. The first thing that we say to our clients who are selling their business, your number one job is to continue to execute and drive great results within your business. Continue to build pipeline, go close deals, go delight customers. And that's hard to do in and of itself. Well, you start to take your eye off the ball because you think that you can, go it alone. And it's quite honestly a recipe for disaster.
Right, and I think part of this, Matt, with you in that is you also can fall in the same trap of like, another advisor can do this work. So whether that's your lawyer, your accountant, someone else, or even a personal wealth manager, we've seen in the mix. I think there's a lot to this where having the right advisor at the right time really makes a difference to get there. So it's not necessarily just the founder going alone. It's asking that attorney, my attorney can handle that, and that's really tough. It's like a dentist doing knee surgery. The two different worlds that collide, and it just doesn't quite work together. If I switch gears a little bit here, Mike, going over to Mike is what do you do, or what does an advisor do to actually move the numbers in these deals, and what does that process look like, and why does that start to matter?
Yeah, so pre-market prep is super important. To do things like normalize EBITDA. You have to make sure your numbers are bulletproof. And certainly building out marketing materials and finding and fixing risks before buyers see them. Chinks in the armor, if you will, on your financials, and other risks that may have to do with concentration risk based on your customer profiles, or contract risks, or continuity of staff risk, or there's a million risks that you need to look at, that buyers will be looking at, saying, hey, how likely, the lens they hold that up against is how likely am I to be able to realize the forecast and model the return rates with confidence that I will get after making an investment in this business or acquiring this business. And so, M&A is inherently risky no matter what, but we want to remove those that, or at least have a talking point around why they're mitigate those risks ahead of time. Also, a broker adds competitive tension, right? Multiple bidders, in a process like this, help give the seller choices. I think as a business owner, you would like choices, right? Because all deals don't just have to line up around price and terms. They have to also line up strategically and culturally. And each one of those bidders comes with a different mix of strategy fit, culture fit, and financial fit. And so being able to have choices across that spectrum helps you make the right decision for you and your staff and your clients. You lose that leverage when you're representing yourself to one buyer. And frankly, these guys do this for a living and you don't. right? You're going to do this once, and a financial buyer in particular, or even a large strategic buyer, has a whole team of people that this is all they do, and so you need a professional team that does just this in order to be able to interface with them on a peer level to help optimize. I think the other thing that is important is that most brokers have comps data that around other transactions, private to private transactions, that you just won't have access to. And most generalist accountants won't either. That's why a specialist advisor is important. And so understanding where other deals have traded in recent months on firms that look like yours is critically important in the negotiation, because even financial buyers who do this for a living oftentimes don't have a deep bench of access to comps data, and they negotiate from certainly a position of strength versus your access to deal data, but not nearly from the position of someone who's doing lots of valuations in the space every month pursuant to transactions, such as an active vertically aligned broker to your market. So an important consideration. And then understanding sort of, alignment on fees is critically important too, right? So when you think about how that works, and, in the end, as you think about, advisors and how they're paid, typically are paid a retainer plus a success fee. Oftentimes those retainers are rebated from the success fee. So you get alignment around success in the end. And last but not least, I kind of skipped one. We have, seller's discretionary earnings multiples on how that applies to your EBITDA, how that gets worked in, if it gets worked in, and how buyers see that is critically important, because I think it's a balance sheet item, and I won't get too in the weeds here, but understanding how to operationalize that into a transaction is critically important as well.
Yeah, along the way, you're going to have an advisor that understands all of these aspects. I think I just want to reiterate what you just said. Buyers are doing this for a living. You're doing this one time. That can be it's so hard to be aligned and to get this right when it's something so critically. It's likely the biggest decision you'll ever make in your life that has potentially generational wealth potential. And so getting this right the first time, I think, is just something you really consider that when you're going through this process. Matt, I'd like to love to get your opinion of we've talked a lot about what we've talked to is our deals in general. Why does this change, or is there something special or different about the IT services market that our audience should to listen to think about when considering this?
Yeah, for sure. Again, to the point where specialization for an advisor really does matter. There's sort of different maturity levels and value that go along with sort of value levels, right, within the IT services market, right? So, think a high recurring revenue business that is, really embedded into the operations of an end customer. Often, we see this in the managed services market, and that, managed services providers who are serving, small and medium businesses, as well as managed services providers that are selling, upper middle market and enterprise businesses. They really are fundamental to the ongoing operations of their end customers, and it's represented in ongoing revenue streams, with those customers, and that certainly makes a difference versus maybe on the other end of the spectrum, a staff augmentation firm that has done very well in being able to attract talent and then deploy that talent on an augmentation basis. But quite honestly, those services can be displaced very easily. And those services tend to be, can be a bit more lumpy in nature. And so, you think about the quality of that revenue. A well-distributed client base is extremely important, regardless of your sort of maturity level and or quality of revenue level. If you're doing it with one customer or two customers versus you've got it well distributed across a broader customer base, that absolutely matters. And back to the point that you guys were making, because there has been so much activity in this space, buyers have gotten quite a bit smarter, and they are looking at these metrics, because the metrics demonstrate sort of the foundational capability of a firm, the go-to-market capability, the servicing capability, et cetera, et cetera. And they've gotten smarter, and most good professional buyers have advisors of their own that understand the metrics and understand the space. And so, it all goes back to the ability of an advisor to guide appropriately. I mean, oftentimes we have clients who come to us and they say, well, I'd really like to get this done, as quickly as possible. And there could be reasons to do so, personal reasons to do so, health reasons to do so. But if there aren't, and there is an opportunity to improve in a relatively quick period of time some of these metrics, we'll work with them and guide them appropriately, so that we can be 25% higher than an average asking price, because we've done our job to ensure that the numbers are as good as they can be, and they're well represented, and that the story and the actions, match those numbers. So it absolutely, there's some specifics to every vertical market, but there's some real specifics that are in play in the IT services market. And I'll just say, it matters more today than ever, as we are in the early stages of the, artificial intelligence revolution.
Now, all well said, and I think that you're exactly right. We're in this changing environment right now, and it opens up an opportunity like we haven't seen before. And so I think it's a great time to talk to people who are seeing deals in this space and understand what's right for you, for sure. And speaking of that, Mike, I'd love to help us to close this out here, but what's the Revenue Rock experience show, when we're working with people, and follow that up with, what should a founder do, right now?
Yeah, I mentioned, I think, our own experience, a couple things. First, the market shows that, a lot of deals are getting done, right? Q1 26 had over 2,300 deals done. Again, based on over $200 billion in enterprise value with biz buy sell. Most buyers want reoccurring cash flow, and our experience, echoes that. They're really passing on flat performers. Most sellers think 55% of sellers think they can get their price today, regardless of their business condition, which I think isn't really the case. You want a high performing business, to Matt's point, one that's up and to the right, and you should take the time to focus on getting it up and to the right before you contemplate sort of an exit or a recap. Most of those buyers worry that waiting makes it worse, right? So that, they're thinking that needs to happen. And I think an interesting stat we know about, is, and I know we've had a lot of talk in the office about this, is, this, what we call the silver tsunami, right? You got 12 million boomer businesses, 10 trillion in assets coming to market. And there's certainly the IT services market as we see it, echoes that trend. Lots and lots of people that are looking to get to sell their businesses. IT services businesses typically are not passed on from one generation to the next. So, that makes some sellers typically, or someone that would recap and move on, especially in the silver tsunami category of baby boomers. Our own experience, it's interesting because, the industry, our own close rates are sort of in that top tier rate that I mentioned earlier, kind of in that 80 to 95%, versus kind of a overall industry benchmark for 20 to 30% of deals close. We have 20 plus years of IT services deal data, and I can count on one hand the founders who sold their firm alone that felt good about it. All of them realized it was harder than they thought, that they felt they left money on the table, and they said, if I had to do it again, I would absolutely use an advisor. And we run into those guys, particularly oftentimes in our buy side practice, where maybe they had recapped and they're now with the private equity owned. Maybe they're still leading their business and wanting to go do some acquisitions. And a lot of those guys say, boy, that was tough. So, we just don't generally talk to people that say it was a smooth sailing and, we got the best deal we could have gotten. So, I guess from my perspective, I do believe those stats that hover around about a 20% premium for using an advisor to roll in your own deal are accurate. But I think it goes way beyond that. Just price, as I said before, you want choices. As a seller, you want choices, and you need choices that span the trifecta of strategic fit, cultural fit, and financial fit to really, make the best choice. And in order to do that, you need an advisor to help you.
No, it's all great stuff. Matt, any closing thoughts?
No, I mean, I think that take the stats to heart. I think the one thing that we talked about is maybe didn't touched on is the emotionality aspect of this. Oftentimes we're representing firms and founders or leaders that are looking to sell in, which is, if you've listened to this podcast, you know that term, but it means they're going to be continuing forward with a firm. And, the emotional aspect of this is real. There is pushing and shoving that occurs. And if you're looking to sell in, boy, the worst thing in the world is you do not want battle scars, either, with your buyer or, with yourself. You want to go in, hand in hand, and ready to go get it in the next chapter. And so, it's kind of one of those things that's oftentimes overlooked, because in those scenarios, it's not just the success of this first transaction, it's the ability to go win it together in a new company. And so that's just one more important point, that an advisor, really reduces the emotion throughout the process and allows you as a seller and your buyer to come out and be in a position to get after it and go win again. So, great subject, Ryan. Mike?
Yeah. Well, with that, I would just have a couple closing comments. I would recommend you start a conversation, not a commitment, with various brokers, get to know them and their process, and do your early preparation and start thinking about who you might want to work with if you're considering doing this in 27 and beyond. I think that homework will serve you well. And with that, we'll tie a ribbon on it for this week's Shoot the Moon podcast. So we encourage you to tune in next week when we'll unpack further topics on how to optimize, grow, sell, and or buy an IT services company. With that, make it a great week.